Audiobook of Contrasting Identities, Navigating Identity Politics Conversations. Chapter 1. What is Identity Politics? What is identity politics? There are many political commentators who will hold a view about IP. However, both its proponents and its critics are seldom able to describe what IP is. If pressed on this question, critics sometimes give examples such as a transgender person forcing me to use their preferred pronoun, or Black Lives Matter, or a feminist yelling at me to check my privilege. Proponents at times also give examples instead of a definition, such as gender equality or being against hate speech. A lack of a clear definition is where a lot of the trouble starts. This has made proponents and critics talk past one another on what counts as IP. For instance, proponents will recognize the civil rights movement and the first and second waves of feminism as IP, whereas many critics will not. Others will also claim that all politics are IP, because political action relates to something to do with the participant's identity. Hence, if one wants to argue for or against IP, knowing the correct definition is key to making any progress on the discussion of it. The best description of what IP is comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, H. Cressida, 2018, where it says, the laden phrase, identity politics, has come to signify a wide range of political activity and theorizing founded in the shared experiences of injustice of members of certain social groups. Rather than organizing solely around belief systems, programmatic manifestos, or party affiliation, identity political formations typically aim to secure the political freedom of a specific constituency marginalized within its larger context. Members of that constituency assert or reclaim ways of understanding their distinctiveness that challenge dominant oppressive characterizations with the goal of greater self-determination. So, from this definition, it can be made more clearly what kind of political behavior can adequately fulfill the criteria of being IP. Consider each sentence. The first sentence refers to people with a shared experience of being wronged, placing them in a position of disadvantage or oppression. For instance, feminism would certainly count. The second sentence distinguishes between party politics, such as being a conservative or a liberal, with being a member of a group that views themselves not as the dominant part of their society. An example of this would be minority groups, such as African Americans in the United States. The third sentence is concerning narratives. Narratives are the stories and understandings from the dominant groups imposed upon the group suffering the perceived injustice. An example of this would be derogatory stereotypes such as all Mexicans are lazy or women belong in the kitchen. This seems to be a fair description of IP. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is hardly an unreliable source, and although slightly more detailed, it is consistent with Merriam-Webster, which describes IP as identity politics took its modern form during the second half of the last century. It emerged as an emancipatory mode of political action and thinking based on the shared experience of injustice by particular groups, notably blacks, women, gays, Latinos, and American Indians. Furthermore, this description is also consistent with the humble Wikipedia, which defines IP as the term identity politics in common usage refers to a tendency of people sharing a particular racial, religious, ethnic, social, or cultural identity to form exclusive political alliances, instead of engaging in the traditional, broad-based party politics, or promote their particular interests without regard or interests of a larger political group. In academic usage, the term has been used to refer to a wide range of political activities and theoretical analysis rooted in the experiences of injustice shared by different social groups. In this usage, identity politics typically aim to reclaim greater self-determination and political freedom for the marginalized groups through understanding their distinctive nature and challenging externally imposed characterizations, instead of organizing solely around belief systems or party affiliations. Therefore, If anyone wishes to dispute this definition of IP, the burden of proof lies with them. Furthermore, the coinage of the term has been attributed to the black feminist organization, the Combahee River Collective, CRC. The CRC's D. Eisenstein, 1978, first usage of the concept is, this focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. In the case of black women, this is a particularly repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept, because it is obvious from looking at all the political movements that have preceded us that anyone is more worthy of liberation than ourselves. We reject pedestals, queenhood, and walking 10 paces behind. To be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. It should be made clear that the CRC are not saying that they have no regard for those outside of their oppressed group, which in this case is women of colour. This will be discussed later regarding socialist criticisms of IP. The CRC stresses this point where they say, although we are feminists and lesbians, we feel solidarity with progressive black men and do not advocate for the fractionalization that white women who are separatists demand. Our situation as black people necessitates that we have solidarity around the fact of race, which white women, of course, do not need to have with white men, unless it is their negative solidarity as racial oppressors. We struggle together with black men against racism, while we also struggle with black men about sexism. The concept of IP through the CRC is consistent with contemporary definitions provided at the beginning of this chapter. It is advocacy for political action, in this case black feminism, against perceived oppression and injustice based on the shared experiences from those who belong to that identity group. With the definition established, and in order to simplify attempts to discover what does and what does not count as IP, below is a list of criteria. 1. Groups who have a shared experience which is grounded in their identity. 2. The shared experience is one of injustice, disadvantage, or oppression. 3. The goal is to collectively challenge that injustice, disadvantage, or oppression through political action. For something to count as IP, all 3 criteria need to be met. If 1 is met and 2 and 3 are not, then it is not IP. If 2 and 3 are met and 1 is not, then it is not IP. For example, I have a shared experience of training in mixed martial arts, MMA. It is part of who I am, so I'll have a shared experience with others who also train in MMA. However, it is not IP since there is no injustice related to that part of my identity. This is a case of criterion 1 being met, but 2 and 3 not being met. It would not make sense to move on from this chapter without discussing what counts or does not count as identity, at least in a political context. For an identity to be politically relevant, it needs to be an aspect of ourselves that can be connected to some social or public significance. This is known in sociology as the sociological imagination, which was coined by C. Wright Mills. The sociological imagination, E. Willis, 2011, is the ability to connect one's private trouble to a public issue. If one Indigenous Australian is incarcerated, that is a private trouble. If Indigenous Australians are the most incarcerated people on earth, M. Ketchell, 2017, that is a public issue. The sociological imagination is the ability to connect those private troubles with public issues. Regarding political identity, the form of identity that best captures what is usually discussed in IP is ascriptive identity. Ascriptive identity is aspects about yourself that situate you into places of advantage or disadvantage that are not based on merit. Some aspects can be race, gender, geographical location, economic class, and so on. Mill's sociological imagination connects well with the ascriptive sense of identity, since it involves being conscious of how a private trouble is connected to a public issue through our identity. This understanding also demonstrates how criteria 1 and 2 of IP are interconnected. Using the ascriptive sense of identity assumes the shared experience of injustice, disadvantage, or oppression. From this, the criteria of IP could be shortened to 1. Groups who have a shared experience which is grounded in their ascriptive identity. 2. The goal is to collectively challenge the issues of that ascriptive identity through political action. Although one could do this, I'll approach the rest of this book with the original 3 criteria, since it stresses the point of identity from the standpoint of injustice, disadvantage, and oppression. Now that the definition of IP is complete, the next chapter will discuss how we can have knowledge of shared experiences through knowledge of acquaintance.